There is a kind of quiet that belongs only to people who have learned to need very little. Not the quiet of peace, but the quiet of someone who has stopped waiting for help and started doing the work themselves. Mira Caulfield had that kind of quiet. She was 29, with ink-stained fingers, and the posture of someone who carried more than she let show. She ran a grist mill on the eastern edge of Denton County, Texas, the same mill her father had built in 1861 before the war took him and the years after took everything else. The building was honest and old, cedar planked on a limestone foundation, set over a limestone creek that ran cold even in August. The wheels still turned. The millstone still ground. That was the part that mattered, and Mira knew how to keep the parts that mattered running. What she couldn't keep running was the rest of it. The sluice gate on the north channel had rotted through at the post. The grain storage shed had lost half its roof to a late spring storm, and the sacks inside had been moved twice to avoid the wet. The access road from the county trail had washed out in 3 places, and the nearest neighbor with a wagon wide enough to haul repair timber was 7 miles east and not in the habit of lending. She had fixed what she could fix alone. The rest she had calculated into a ledger she kept beside the millstone, a running tally of what it would take to keep the Caulfield mill operating through another winter. The number had not changed in 2 months. It stayed on the page like a fact she had not yet figured out how to argue with. On the morning Harlan Briggs first rode down from the county road and stopped at the edge of her property, Mira was in the creek bed up to her knees, packing river clay into the cracked base of the sluice post. It was October. The water was cold enough to make her ankles ache. She did not look up when she heard the horse. She had learned not to look up too fast. Men who arrived on good horses and stopped at property lines were either there to buy something or to tell her it wasn't worth buying. She had heard both enough times to know neither conversation required her full attention before it started. Harlan Briggs dismounted. He was 53 with the kind of build that came from 40 years of actual labor before the money arrived to pay others for it. His coat was good wool, well cut, but not showy. His horse was a dark bay with no silver on the tack. He stood at the edge of the creek bank and looked at the mill wheel turning, at the sluice gate, at the woman in the water doing the work of 2 men with her bare hands and a bucket of river clay. He didn't say anything for a long moment. Mira finally looked up. She read people the way she read millwork. Fast, practical, looking for the structural problem before the cosmetic one. "You're on my land," she said. Not hostile. A fact stated plainly so they both knew where they stood. "I am," Harlan said. "Road's washed out about a 1/4 mile back. I came through the creek crossing." He paused. "Your crossing's holding up better than your road." "I know that." He looked at the sluice post. "Clay packing won't hold past the first hard freeze." "I know that too." He nodded slowly, the way men nod when they have been answered correctly and were not entirely expecting it. "Harlan Briggs," he said. "I run cattle on the Briggs Ranch, north section of the county." Mira had heard the name. Denton County was not so large that a man who owned 40,000 acres went unheard. She had simply never expected one to show up at her creek bank on a Tuesday morning in October, watching her pack clay. "Mira Caulfield." She climbed out of the creek, pulled her boots back on standing in the mud, and didn't apologize for the state of her hands. "The mill is operational. If you need grain milled, the rate is posted at the door. I didn't come about milling." She looked at him. "I came about water," he said. This was the part where most conversations with men of Harlan Briggs's position turned into something she didn't want. Water rights in Denton County were not a simple subject. The limestone creek that ran under her mill wheel had 3 names on 3 different survey maps, and a history of boundary disputes that predated Texas statehood. She had the original deed registered by her father in 1861, with the water access spelled out in terms that were clear if you read them correctly. Several people over the years had chosen not to read them correctly. "The water rights belong to this property," she said. "They're registered and recorded at the county seat. I can show you the documentation." "I know they are," Harlan said. "That's why I'm here." he explained it, standing at the creek bank, plainly, the way he seemed to do most things. The southern range of his cattle operation was running short on reliable water access. The creek that crossed the Caulfield property was the cleanest and most consistent source within a reasonable drive. He wasn't asking for ownership. He was asking to lease crossing rights for cattle movement. 8 weeks in the fall, 3 years, fair market rate, with terms set in writing before a single head of cattle crossed her property line. Mira listened without interrupting. She was good at that. Her father had taught her that the most expensive thing in a negotiation was talking when you should be listening. When Harlan finished, she said, "What's your definition of fair market rate?" he told her. It was in fact fair, more than fair. She had looked up comparable water lease agreements in the county records the previous winter, during a slow week when the creek was frozen and she had nothing to do but read. She knew what the numbers should look like. "I'd want a clause limiting herd size per crossing day," she said. "Too many head at once compresses the bank. It damages the sluice approach." He pulled a small notebook from his coat pocket. "What's your limit?" 80 head per day, staggered to 2 crossings, morning and afternoon. He wrote it down, on his knee, right there at the creek bank, the way a man writes something down when he intends to actually honor it. "The road needs to be passable for a wagon before any cattle movement begins," she added. "Your crew, your materials. The road access is part of the value I'm providing." Agreed. She looked at him steadily. Most men in his position would have offered the money and expected the rest to follow without negotiation. He was writing down terms instead. "I'll have it drafted and notarized by Friday," he said. "I'll have my own copy reviewed before I sign anything. That's sensible." He put the notebook away. He looked once more at the sluice post, at the clay packing, at the storage shed with its missing roof section. "Who's been maintaining this property?" "I have." He nodded again with that same quality of acknowledgement, neither pity nor surprise, just a recognition of a fact. He mounted his horse and rode back through the creek, crossing the way he'd come. Mira stood at the bank for a moment after the sound of hooves faded. Then she went back to the clay packing. She had 2 more hours of daylight and a post that wasn't finished yet. The lease agreement arrived Friday morning by messenger, notarized. 2 copies, with every term she had named, written in clean legal language, and 1 addition she hadn't asked for. A clause requiring the cattle crew to restore any bank compression above a certain measurement before the end of each season. It protected the sluice approach for the following spring. She had not thought to ask for it. She read the clause twice, then a 3rd time. Then she signed both copies and sent one back. His road crew arrived the following Monday. 4 men, a loaded wagon, proper gravel and timber for the washout sections. They worked the road from the county trail down to the mill access in 3 days. On the 2nd day, one of the crew members, an older man named by the others simply as Cork, stopped to look at the storage shed roof from the road. He said nothing to Mira directly. That evening she found 3 squares of cedar shingle stacked neatly at the shed door with a note, "Left over from the road work. Seemed wasteful to haul back." She used every square. The shed roof took 4 hours and 2 buckets of nails she had been rationing for 6 months. When it was done, she stood inside the storage room with a lantern, checking the corners where the leaks had been worst. Dry. All of it dry. She blew out the lantern and walked back to the mill in the dark. She had made herself one promise when her father died and left her the property and the debts and the decision. Survive the first year, keep the deed, face the second year with the mill still running. It was the 3rd year now. She was still making the same promise, just extending it forward, season by season, like a fence line that moved 1 post at a time. Promise was quite more than intention to keep. She knew that. She had known it for 3 years. November came in hard. The first freeze arrived on a Tuesday night without warning, which was the way it always arrived in Denton County, no matter what the almanac claimed. Mira was banking the last of the root vegetable beds in straw when she heard a horse come fast up the county road and turn toward her property without slowing. The man who dismounted didn't bother with the property line. He walked straight to the mill door, tried the handle, found it locked, and turned to look for her with the expression of a man who had decided the looking would take no longer than he allowed it to. His name was Harlow Kane. She knew him by reputation the way she knew most things, through the county records and the talk that moved through grain customers like water through limestone. Kane worked land acquisition out of Fort Worth. He had acquired 14 parcels in Denton and Parker counties in the past 3 years, most of them from women, most of them from people who had been dry 2 seasons running and couldn't see a third. He was not a forger, he was not violent in any way that could be proved. He was precise about timing, about finding people at the moment when the arithmetic of keeping something was hardest to solve, and presenting numbers that looked generous until the terms consumed them. Miss Caulfield. He had the tone of a man who had already decided the conversation had gone well. I've been authorized to make you an offer on this property, including the water access and millworks. Mira set down her straw fork. The property is under a water rights lease. Signed, notarized, registered at the county seat. Leases have terms, Kane said pleasantly. Terms end, the leaseholder is Harlan Briggs. Something shifted in Kane's expression, not dramatically. Just a small recalibration, like a man adjusting his weight to a different footing. Callaway territory, he said, almost to himself, using an older county name that no longer applied, a habit that revealed more than he intended. He recovered quickly. Mr. Briggs is a busy man. He may not have a strong personal interest in the specifics of a small water lease. He let the pause sit. I'm offering $1,800. Clean title. Immediate close. The mill generates more than that annually when the road is passable, Mira said. Which it now is. This year, Kane said. Next year, the drought may return. The year after. He looked at the storage shed, the patched roof, the creek bank with its clay-packed post. This property requires significant ongoing investment. A woman alone managing it indefinitely is a fact, Mira said. Not a problem you need to solve. Kane's pleasant expression held but went thinner. I'll give you until Thursday to consider. The offer won't improve, then it won't improve, she said. The answer today is no. The answer Thursday will be no. If you ride onto this property again without invitation, I'll have the county sheriff here to meet you. He put his card on the mill door handle and rode out. She watched him go, then picked up the card, looked at it once, and went inside. She wrote in her ledger, Kane, H. November 9. Offer made and declined. Thursday cited as return date. Sent rider to Briggs same afternoon. The rider she sent was 12-year-old Petey Marsh from the neighboring farm, who would run messages for 2 bits and a piece of cornbread, and who understood without being told that speed mattered more than ceremony. Harlan arrived Wednesday evening. He came quietly with 2 men she didn't know, arriving after dark without announcement, tying the horses at the back of the property rather than the front. She found him on her porch when she came out to check the millstone housing before bed. He sat in the one chair she kept outside, looking at the creek, not at her. You sent the message fast, he said. I saw how Kane works, she said. Thursday doesn't leave much time. No, he agreed. It doesn't. She told him what had been said, word for word. She had a good memory for exact language, a habit developed from years of reading lease agreements and deed restrictions and grain contracts, where a single phrase could mean 2 different things depending on who was reading it. Harlan listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. He'll come with someone Thursday, he said. Kane doesn't make second visits alone. I know. You have something for your own defense? She went inside and came back with a Winchester rifle she kept behind the millstone housing. She held it in a way that answered the question without overstating it. Harlan nodded. Nobody's asking you to stay inside. Good, she said, because I won't. Thursday came gray and cold. Kane arrived at 10 in the morning with 2 riders who had the particular quality of men hired for a specific kind of presence. Not muscle, exactly, but the implication of it. His smile was in place before he'd dismounted. He found Harlan standing at the mill door with his 2 men. Mira stood 6 feet to Harlan's left, the Winchester at her shoulder on its sling, her eyes level. Kane took in the scene without expression. He looked at Harlan. "Briggs," he said. "Didn't expect you here, personally. I inspect my water access, personally," Harlan said. "The lease on this property is registered under my name. What happens here is my business." Kane looked at Mira, at the rifle, at the two men behind Harlan who held themselves with the stillness of people who had been in this kind of situation before and weren't concerned about being in it again. "Miss Caulfield has until Sunday," Kane said. "The offer is still open." "The offer was declined Monday," Mira said. Her voice carried without effort across the cold yard. "It was declined when you implied my property was fragile. It's declined now. This mill is not for sale. The next time you ride onto this land, you'll find a deputy sheriff waiting for you, and I will have a written account of every word you said on Tuesday to hand him." A long silence. One of Kane's riders looked at a fixed point past the storage shed. The other shifted his weight in the saddle. Kane looked at Harlan one more time. He was reading the situation the way Mira read millwork, looking for the structural failure point, the weak post, the place where clay was doing the work that timber should be doing. He found nothing to work with. He touched his hat brim, turned his horse, and rode toward the county road without speaking again. Nobody said anything for a moment after the sound of hooves faded into the cold air. Then Cork, standing behind Harlan's left shoulder, said quietly, "That's the first time I've seen Kane leave without getting a signature or a promise." Harlan glanced at Mira. She was already walking back to the mill. There was a shipment of sorghum due from the Weston farm before noon, and the millstone needed to be dressed before it arrived. Word moved through Denton County the way it always had. On horseback and across fence lines and in the back of general stores where men talked while women listened, and then went home and told the truth about what had been said. By the end of the following week, 2 other property owners had sent messages to Mira asking what had happened at the Caulfield mill on Thursday morning. A land acquisition man backing down from a signed approach was not a common occurrence in that county, and people who lived close to the land paid attention to uncommon occurrences. August Tolley, the county land recorder at the Cedar Falls office, stopped Harlan outside the courthouse steps 2 weeks after. "Heard Kane left your water lease property empty-handed," August said. He did. August worked his hat in his hands slowly. He was 61. Had recorded deeds in Denton County since before the war, and had the specific patience of a man who had watched property change hands across 3 decades and 2 major droughts. "You know what you've done," he said, "leasing from a single woman with a failing road and a rotted sluice gate. Every acquisition man between here and Fort Worth is going to look twice before approaching a property with your name in the records." "That's the intention," Harlan said. August looked at him for a long moment. "Most men with your resources would have simply bought the parcel." "She didn't want to sell." "You took that for an answer." It was the answer she gave. August was quiet. He looked down at the ledger he was carrying, the way men look at something familiar when they need a moment to organize what they are thinking. "In 31 years of recording property in this county," he said, "I'm not sure I've seen that. A man who could buy anything taking no for an answer from a woman with nothing but a deed and a rifle." He said it without ceremony, the way plain truths land when they are simply stated and not dressed up. Harlan rode out to the Caulfield mill the following afternoon and told Mira what August had said. She was dressing the millstone, a task that required a sharp eye and a steady hand, and she didn't stop working while he talked. When he finished, she said, "He's right. That is not common." She said it without irony. She set down the dressing pick and looked at Harlan directly. "Thank you. For Thursday, you handled Thursday," he said. "I was just standing in my water access." Something moved in her expression. Not warmth exactly. Recognition. The look of a person who has been seen accurately and is deciding what to do with that. December settled in hard. The creek ran lower but steady, the way good limestone-fed water runs, slower and cold but dependable. Harlan's cattle crossed twice a week through the access points specified in the lease. Mira monitored the crossings as the agreement required, logging water level and bank compression and any observed changes in the sluice approach. She sent weekly reports to the Briggs ranch address in Cedar Falls. He replied with brief, precise notes that added context to what she was tracking. Herd weight averages for the current crossing season, which affected compaction calculations, and a note about a drainage technique used on a creek crossing on his north range that had stabilized the approach significantly. It was a correspondence of practical facts that was, without either of them naming it, something else entirely. He came in person the second Thursday of December, ostensibly to inspect the crossing before the heaviest cattle movement of the season. He found her at the creek bank with a measuring rod, charting the edge of compaction from the previous week's crossing. "You'll want a rock deflector upstream of the main approach," she said without looking up. "Slows the cattle before they reach the soft bank. Spreads the load." He crouched beside her to look at the area she was indicating. She was right. The technique was used by experienced ranchers across the limestone creek systems of North Texas, practical knowledge that lived in people who had worked the land long enough to learn it, not in engineering manuals. They stood. Neither moved away with the hurry of someone who found the proximity uncomfortable. "These reports you've been sending," Harlan said, "whoever works this property in 10 years will know exactly how this creek behaves through every season. That kind of knowledge usually leaves with the person who held it." She looked at him. "You've been thinking about who works this property in 10 years. "I have," he said. The cold was honest and deep. The creek moved under its shelf of edge ice, dark and steady in the middle channel. "Miss Caulfield," he said in the register of someone opening a negotiation, but slower. "I'd like to discuss whether the arrangement between us might take a different form. Something longer than 3 years. She held his gaze without looking away. "You're talking about more than the water lease." "I am." She did not answer immediately. She never answered anything that deserved consideration with less than it deserved. She answered him 4 days later. Sunday morning, frost on the ground, no ceremony about it. She rode to the Briggs ranch, tied her horse at the gate, and walked out to the south pasture where he was checking the fence line from horseback. He saw her coming and waited. "I have conditions," she said. Something moved through his expression. "Quiet, careful. The Caulfield mill stays registered in my name. The property, the water access, the deed. Separate from your holdings, agreed. I manage the mill operations and the grain accounts. The ledger system I've built stays intact. No one absorbs it into your ranch accounts. I'd expect nothing less. And I am a partner in what this becomes," she said, "not a piece of it that gets consulted when convenient." He looked at her steadily. "I told my road crew that you would know more about what this property needs than they did. I said it before they arrived. I meant it." He paused. "I've known what I was looking at since October." The silence between them held more than was being said. "Then we're agreed," she said. He extended his hand. She shook it, the same way she'd shaken it the first time. Firm, clean, without the hesitation of someone unsure of the terms. Spring came slowly, the way it always came to North Texas, testing the ground before it committed. The root beds Mira had banked in November came up clean. The storage shed held dry. The sluice gate, rebuilt properly over the winter with timber rather than clay, ran without failure through the first high water of April. The creek crossing showed no bank compression above the lease's allowable measurement. She logged it in the spring report and sent a copy to Cedar Falls. On the first warm morning of April, she was turning the first garden row when she heard Harlan's horse in the yard. She looked up with the easy recognition of someone who knew the sound and found it welcome. He walked to the garden edge and looked at the turned rows. "Getting in late," he said. "Rotating off the winter rye ground," she said. "Better for what I'm planting." He nodded. "Sound practice." They stood together in the early spring light, the mill wheel turning behind them, the creek running cold and clear over its limestone bed. Two people who had built something careful, condition by condition, repair by repair. Not out of rescue, not out of loneliness. Out of the recognition that some partnerships are worth more than the sum of what each person brings, because each person brings something the other didn't know to ask for. There is a kind of wealth that doesn't show up in county records. It doesn't appear in lease agreements or property registrations or the annual figures that get reviewed at the Cedar Falls Land Office each January. It lives in a gate that hangs true after 3 years of hard winters, in a sluice that runs clean through a wet spring, in the handwriting of two people who built their agreement on what each could offer rather than what each was afraid to lose. The deed to the Caulfield mill stayed in Mira's name. It didn't need to change. Both of them knew exactly what it meant, and what it would mean for the 10 years after that and the 10 years after those. That was enough. That was more than enough. You're listening to Shadows of the Old West, where the stories of the frontier are told the way they actually happened. In the details, in the work, in the people who stayed when staying was the harder choice. Leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from. I read every single one. Subscribe. The next story is already waiting.